So we've got to modify American style individualism. So that in other words, if we continue to be individuals that do not have to think about the unintended consequences of our actions, then white supremacy is still going to exist, because you've got to have that. Okay, let me give you a historical example. In all the advances, and I'll use the case of African Americans, in all the advances that African Americans have made in terms of civil rights, legally dismantling segregation, they have been dependent upon modification of American style individual autonomy. And that's usually not pointed out. For example, in the 60s, some Black college students on their own, they were having a discussion in their dorm rooms, and they said, look, we're sick and tired of this segregation business. So they went to these stores like Woolworths and sat in. They didn't have a right then to do that. They were asserting that they had a right to do that. The proprietors said, well, this is my store, this is Woolworths or whatever it is. We have the right to decide who gets to come in. That's our individual right, right? We don't have the right to go to Black communities and to terrorize you. We admit that, but we don't have to eat with you, right? Well, and the same thing with, we don't have to ride on the bus with you, mingled throughout the bus. You have to sit in the back of the bus. We don't have to rent to you, all right? We don't have to hire you. And because we have the individual right to do that. That's classic American individual. This country is built on this notion of liberty. Jefferson called America the empire for liberty, right? So in other words, that liberty, that autonomy that existed then in the 1960s, early 60s, was dependent upon the acceptance of restricting the liberty of groups that had very little power to articulate their grievances, right? So that liberty, let's look at liberty a different way. That liberty depended on the ability of people who were oppressing, the ability to oppress particular groups that were socially isolated and recognized as inferior, and that it was legitimate to keep them out. Now, they styled it differently. We have the right to do it. But that autonomy, in other words, I'm trying to flip the definition of it. That autonomy was a tool of oppression. Because in other words, to say, well, I have the right not to admit you is actually to say, I have the right to oppress you, right? I have the right, and that's rationalized by saying, well, it's just a question of individual liberty. Now, eventually, they had to modify that. They had to modify their individual autonomy and say, well, I don't have the right to do that. The law stepped in and said, well, you don't have the right to do that. And you know that they didn't just change overnight. They tried to do it by other means, and in housing and education, there's still segregation because you can try to do it by other means. So the fight has always been to preserve that sense of liberty in America, that sense of autonomy in America. But what autonomy means, autonomy can be very, very good. I'm not opposed to individual autonomy, but I'm opposed to the autonomy that is actually a tool of oppression. All right, so when Americans got to, and Benjamin Franklin put it very, very well, this is how white supremacy configures the world in a way that allows it to achieve its results. Benjamin Franklin was interested in, as all of the founders were, interested in what was called the Ohio Territory. Unfortunately, people lived there, right? The Shawnee lived in the Ohio Territory, and they waged like almost 100 years war against the British and then America, the United States. Benjamin Franklin argued to the British, well, you need to support us to open that land up. Well, why? Why should you move in there? Well, because we are a very vibrant, vigorous, and expansive people, and we're stuck on the East Coast. And because we don't have the land in which to expand, the Indians and their French allies, by preventing us to move in there, are preventing us to have more children. They are actually killing, and he said this, they're actually killing our children. They're preventing them from being born, right? It's like a sort of socio-political abortion. They're preventing that from happening, right? And there was, and eventually there was a war, and the French and Indian War. And at the end of the war, the British said, well, all right, we don't want to have to keep fighting these wars. All right, you can't, they drew a line down the Appalachian Mountains, proclamation line. You can't settle west of that line. And the Americans were very, very upset. We didn't go to war for that, you know, and the revolution eventually settled that question, because then they moved into Indian land. Well, I have the right to expand because this land is open and free, and I can settle on it. You're not doing anything with it. I'm not harming you. That notion of liberty was a tool of oppression. That's a tool. I have the right to come and settle in Massachusetts, even though I am bringing smallpox, you know, what they call virgin soil plagues that are killing you off. And I know that that's happening to you, because I'm thanking God that he has intervened and killed off these savages. And I'm not stopping. You know, I mean, the first time I came, maybe I didn't know, but I recognize it now, and I'm not stopping because I have the liberty. That's a tool of oppression. That's a tool of oppression. Right? So you got to modify that. And today, for example, modifying it means, well, the institution, maybe it's a business institution, educational institution, whatever, the government of the United States, we have this big blah, blah, blah agenda. Well, because that agenda is not addressing my needs, right? You're pursuing it at my expense. And that's oppressing me, right? So that has to change.